Jump into the dynamics of how people characteristically tend to impact vegetation negatively. So there are some positive impacts here and there for vegetation as a function of recreation, but generally speaking, the rate and not severity, but the positive intensity of positive impacts as a function of recreation are far outstripped by things like, intentional, professional, ecosystem restoration, ecology kind of stuff. So we're mostly going to focus on the negative impacts. It's a lot, and they tend to focus into very characteristic groups. So as we're going through these, there's a lot of them. I'm going to have to go kind of fast, but I want you to think about, reflect on any trips that you've been on. Have you ever encountered any of these? And odds are that most of us have seen at least some of this without necessarily recognizing it. So just to kind of lay the groundwork here, we're going to talk about resistance as the ability to withstand impact in the first place, and resilience as the ability to bounce back from it. So these are I guess pretty crucial or inescapable things for this kind of chapter in our class so far. All right, so these are experimental trampling studies done mostly in the late 70s and early 1980s by guys named like David Cole of the Intermountain Research Station of the Forest Service and so forth. So put down a veg quadrat on thick grasses. This is species specific and habitat specific for things like elevation. But in general, the basic idea here is that, again, that vegetation up to a point can prostrate. It can lay down, be walked on, spring back up after a while, not a big deal. And that is the resistance characteristic of the grass in that case. After the grass is trampled, but not yet dead, then we're into the resilience phase of that grass to heal actual tissue damage that is causing it to not be able to spring back up. So if you've ever folded a blade of grass and seen that wet line at the fold line, that's the fluid, mostly nutrients of the grass getting exposed at that point and essentially cutting off the plant's blood supply at that site. So this illustrates at 250 passes, so one person walking by 250 times, or 10 people more likely walking by 25 times each. As you can see, it looks about the same. These are old photographs from that era, so it's a little bit hard to see. You can see the individual pixels instead. It's not really any long-term harm at all, right? So this is the resistance phase. This is what that looks like. There's a visible trail, there's a height reduction in the grasses, but there's not any real physiological injury. After 1,000 passes, we have height reduction and tissue damage. So we're into the resilience phase of this dynamic of impact. We're into the resilience phase, not the extirpation phase, because a month on, that trampling lane looks exactly like the pre-trampling condition. So 1,000 passes is enough during the sort of peak of the growing season to lay the stuff down and create a visible trail, which is a releaser cue for subsequent people. Oh, there must be something interesting at the far end of this trail. So in some cases, it's going to be a bit of a problem because one impact triggers subsequent impacts through that releaser cue dynamic. Okay, so if we draw a simple graph, and we'll see some examples of this on a species-specific curve in our reading for this section, chemical vegetation. We have an impact versus time relationship going on here. So, at the beginning, with a number of passes, let's say 0 passes, there's 0 impact. Graphing from 0% impact to 100% impact. To make it generalized across lots of species, lots of growth forms like grassoid versus tree. And at 0 passes, 0 impact. At 250 passes, there's some impact, but it hasn't really even caused any tissue damage yet. So there might be a few percent impact, a few percent cover loss, if you want to think of it that way. Okay? A few blades of grass ripped up just sort of on accident. After 1,000 passes, 4 times as much in this case, so 1, 2, 3, 4, the impact is quite a bit more severe. So the impact perhaps much higher. Assuming that you're getting 250 passes per day, for example. So 250, 500, 750, 1,000 passes. Okay, so time axis, trampling pressure axis versus impact. We have a nonlinear relationship. We overwhelm resistance and the rate of impact goes up. The slope on the graph goes way up. In some cases, for a less resistant species, we were talking about cryptobiotic crust the other day, about a week ago. Well, that goes with one step, 0 to 100% impact. Okay? But 1 month later, we are back to, and it takes about a month, back to the pre-trampling condition. So, this is 4 days in. 30 days in, we're functionally back down to 0. So our graph would look something like this. Now, when you take more time points, when you do more sampling at a finer level of detail than 250 passes at a time, you get a more smoothed out curve. It looks characteristically like this. Okay? But in the absence of more information, we have to connect the dots kind of straight. So this is going to be repeated, but with different slopes for every different species. This is going to be repeated, but with different slopes for every kind of habitat in which each of your species can be found. So dry desert grasses are going to have a much slower recovery rate. We're dropping back down towards 0% impact real slow in the desert. That same species in a more, mesic environment where it's getting a little bit more comfortable level of preset, it's going to drop back down fairly quickly on this 30-day time frame instead of a 6-month to 2-year time frame. Right? Sometimes it takes vegetative communities multiple years to respond to and recover from impacts. So we'll see what that looks like here in a bit. All right, so above tree line, above in the subalpine zone, this is a video I took at Rocky Mountain National Park some years ago. We're going to see how this actually looks en plein air, as the artist would say. I have a terrible French accent, I don't know how to say that, but like in real life. It's just people walking across grass to go look at some piled up rocks. Like there's no real recreation value there, but we're paying the price tag for impacts. So we've got some management efforts in place. We call these coping lines or scree walls, you may have heard of. Just piling rocks in a line to provide a visual border would be one management response to this. And as it turns out, 75 to 90% of people see these coping lines and they think, oh, okay, well, it's not a fence like we have here, but the Park Service, in this case, wants me to kind of stay on the path. And oh yeah, I remember there was a sign at the trailhead there back at the parking lot that said, please stay on the path. These subalpine patches of grass are actually pretty fragile. Okay, so this same species down in the valleys at Rocky Mountain National Park, they grow real thick. And the caribou and the elk that are there just love to munch on this stuff kind of all day long. It's real nice. But up here, same species, much lower impact recovery rate, much lower resilience. Make sense? Cool. All right, so we want this to not be a surprise. We want this to be kind of an automatic thought for you as the ranger, the habitat manager, for each species in each kind of elevation level or each latitude band for a long and narrow vertically or north-south aligned park. You want to just be thinking, okay, I'm at higher elevation, everything's more fragile, I gotta be more leaning towards fencing humans in, which they hate, understandably. You don't want to be in a cattle chute on vacation. And leaning away from stuff like information and education, which visitors like. It's nice to read a cool sign that says, hey, stay on the path. And here's why. But a lot of people, like these two boys in this video, they're not reading the sign at all. They walk right by them and then out onto the grass. In some cases, right next to the sign that says, don't go on the grass. Okay. Some kinds of vegetation species, like mosses, that is bryophytes, like non-vascular plants, they are growing on very wet, so low shear resistance soils. And they themselves are very, very low resistance, although they might be fairly high resilience, growing back from impacts. But they'll take those impacts real hard right from the outset. So in that case, it's not a function of, we have sort of a grace period of resistance here. So if this is for grasses, bryophytes, mosses, stuff like that, with one pass of a mountain biker somersaulting through can shear off a whole clump of that stuff real quick with a lot fewer than 250 passes. Does that make sense? So we're getting up towards 100% way faster, but maybe in some cases dropping back down to the previous system faster than some of those slower growing grasses. Okay? A lot of that depends on the nutrient quality suspended in the water that is just kind of typically soaking the soil below the bryophyte. Okay? So, they can be low resistance, they usually are. They can be low or high resilience depending on nutrient conditions. So, that's kind of how that goes. All right. Moving up from grasses and bryophytes in terms of growth form up to forbs, so things like non-woody forest floor vegetation like ferns, for example, we're into forbs. Okay? 0 passes, pre-trampling impact. At 250 passes, these things are destroyed. They just don't look brown yet because these were freshly trampled. Right? Resistance completely overwhelmed on pass number 1. You can't step on a fern and it just not really care. After 1,000 passes, we've got more than height reduction. They're prostrate because they're dead. All right? So, after 1,000 passes, we're up to 100% impact, and a month later, none of it's grown back. So, this looks like an even more severe curve of, with one pass, we're up to 100%, and then it flatlines at the top of the graph, where things are bad, and it's going to be another season. Hopefully that trampling happened after those forbs seeded out. But usually that happens quite a bit later in the shady forest floor in the growing season, yeah? So most of this thing's season is vulnerable to getting trampled pre-seeding out, and we're relying on the existing seed bank in that soil. So it can grow back. It's going to go back to 0% impact, but we're going to have to wait 365 days for it to do that, or 350 days if we're 15 days into the growing season when the trampling happens, and so forth. Okay? So, forbs, not real resistant to any impact. And yeah, there can be sort of resilient, but kind of, sort of, not really. I mean, a 1-year time scale isn't great. And that is an entire year for that releaser queue of the visible trail that people have just walked in this season through those forest forbs. Other people can go that way too, or have the idea now to go that way where maybe they wouldn't have before. Okay, so dry shrubs. And shrubs, we're going to move up one growth form again to larger and more woody stems. So when I say shrubs, we're talking basal rosettes or clusters of woody stems instead of single or clustered herbaceous stems. Okay? Dry shrubs, high resistance. If you've ever been walking in the desert, you want to be wearing jeans or chaps or like snake bite chaps, because there are so many things trying to stab you in the desert because they have to adapt to be very unpleasant to walk near. So they tend to be high resistance. That spiny growth, that yucca and agave, it looks like a big pincushion or a porcupine, sort of a growth form. Well, you can actually get pierced to the bone and need a tetanus shot if you walk into one of those at full speed. Like 2 miles an hour is enough to pierce your meat to the depth of a couple of inches and hopefully not break off the tip of that thing inside of you. But that sure does work pretty well in discouraging trampling. Whippy shrubs that are not technically woody, like rubus, like raspberry type species, or things that grow in long, thorny, flexible branches. Those tend to be very resistant to impacts as well, for much the same reason, even if they're not rigid, woody growth. Either way, trampling is highly discouraged, and so sometimes you'll see where you haven't seen it anywhere else on the trail, a whole bunch of just like blackberry or raspberry rubus planted along the edge of a trail where they are trying to hide and close off a visitor-created trail off to that side, because nobody wants to push through that stuff year-round. It works really well. It's kind of a green fencing, okay? Now, unfortunately, the dryness, the nutrient lack of availability, the paucity of nutrient cycling in a desert environment means that there's just not going to be much recovery when impact does happen. So, people are not typically walking through desert stuff, but it sure as heck is fun for some people to drive through it and spend a whole bunch of chemical to kinetic energy conversion in the form of internal combustion engines, or these days with battery electric stuff, but battery electric trucks not really here yet, as of 2023. And, you know, it's not real hard to run over any one of those in an off-road truck. Is anybody familiar with the Baja race? So you're driving as fast as you can with heavily modified vehicles at 50, 60 miles an hour over all kinds of terrain for, was it like a week long, something like that? It's like a 1,000-mile race. I forget what it is. Anyway, several days at least. And if there's a shrub in your way, you're not even slowing down, right? You're hammered down on the gas to get through that shrub, not around it, because cutting the wheel hard in sand is going to get you pretty well dug in. So, unfortunately, some kinds of recreation just cannot be made compatible with desert vegetation, in particular shrubs. They're big enough that they're a target, but they're not so big that the truck needs to go around it. Like, you wouldn't be driving full speed through a forest without a road because you're going to hit a bunch of immovable trees. Here, those sagebrush, those manzanita, there's all sorts of like desert or chaparral, like California coast style vegetation that'll grow out there. And they're just in that sweet spot of too big for the tires to roll right over it and not hurt it, and too small for the truck to have to avoid it. So we see this particular interaction being kind of ruinous for that kind of more deserty, even like woodland type environments, where it's open canopy for the most part. So again, in more dry environments, the American Southwest, there's a lot of places, A, with a fire ban in the first place, and B, where there's not a wildfire risk, but the pressure of browsing, humans browsing for dead down wood to burn in a campfire, is higher than the absolutely tiny amount of cellulosic material production each year in some of these places where you see like mesquite trees or pinyon juniper, stuff like that, but just very few of them, one here or there, for example. In this whole frame, we've got just a couple of individual tree organisms, and the rest isn't real good for making campfires out of, because you don't want to make a campfire out of tumbleweed. What if it starts to tumble? Make sense? Good. Okay. So here, this isn't a drive over it kind of impact, because we're not really driving over full-size trees, but it's a, man, my redneck TV isn't working, my campfire isn't working until I take the only cellulosic material that's not going to roll away on me and build my fire out of it. So, in the same way, high latitude areas, whether or not they're desert heat, can experience the same kinds of pressure. High latitude areas, like in southern Alaska, for example, are extremely nutrient poor, to the point that bears shitting in the woods after eating salmon fertilize individual tree seedlings because there's basically no other bioavailable soil nutrients for that seed bank in that forest. So, in some places where that cold Alaskan coastal rain is washing what little boreal soil entisol nutrient presence is there, we have, this was verified in studies as of 6-8 years ago, something like that. They tracked grizzlies and mapped out where they pooped, and then went back to those sites the following growth season and found that those were the only places where seedlings were getting started. So, we were talking about how you got to manage your vegetation really to keep your wildlife species alive. In this case, we got to manage the bear population to keep the plant species alive. It is weird at high elevation and at high latitude, north or south. Okay? So, you can be the unpopular park ranger in saying, hey, no campfires. You can imagine how in Alaska it'd be nice to have a campfire, because the non-winter season is a couple of months in southern central Alaska. So, it can be unpopular, but people don't necessarily understand that, hey, this is an extremely nutrient capped area. We can't really deal with this. So, submature trees like saplings, a seedling might be small enough to avoid impact, or be flexible enough as like a first season seedling to prostrate and then spring back up when somebody happens to step on it in the middle of the forest. Mature trees, probably big enough to avoid serious impacts. They might have some lower branches broken off for fire making and so forth, but mature 50, 60-year-old tree, generally not too worried about getting trampled. Submature trees, those seedlings and saplings that are kind of knee-high on up to a couple inches DBH, diameter at chest height, those are at high risk of trampling. Okay? So, they are high resilience, but they are low resistance because of their age or their growth stage. And then mature trees, kind of the opposite. So a mature tree, on our impact versus trampling pressure and or time axis, a mature tree looks like this. It's kind of the inverse of a bryophyte. Doesn't matter, 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 doesn't care. They're pretty resistant to most impacts. Now, certain shallow rooting species, coastal redwoods, sequoias, this flat part, this resistance phase, is like a century long. And then you get a whole bunch of visitors there, and all of a sudden, they start dying because the soil has become compacted around their entire root radius, and that stops nutrient uptake over the course of like a year or two. After a century of people being there, it just gets to that tipping point of doing okay, doing okay, doing okay. Oh, all of my soil is compacted, I can't eat, and now I'm going to starve. Okay? So, Aside from slow-growing species, aside from marginal growth conditions, aside from shallow rooting conditions, mature trees is one of the last things we typically have to worry about. But mature trees do get characteristic and specific impacts. We'll see what some of those are. So, we've seen this clip about snags and hollows. Snags we would consider to be no resistance. They are considered a high-value target for people, typically young males, who want to push over a tree because they have more energy than wisdom at that age. Cub Scouts tend to go, or Scouts, I guess, for a long time, especially back before the intervention of Leave No Trace, when they had things like hatchet merit badges. It was terrifying for a campground manager or a park ranger to have groups of 20, 50, a few hundred scouts coming in for a big group thing. Like, there would be hatchet scars and lantern scars and broken lower limbs and just everything. And especially the standing deadwood would be just hammered, so to speak, by those groups, because they're spending a lot of time in camp. There's a high energy to wisdom ratio. There is genuine incentivization from the organization to learn how to use a hatchet and be bored around your campsite with it, and so forth. So, for a long time, that was a problem. These days, less so. So yeah, those snags, super important for habitat. And unfortunately, as the wood decays while the tree is still on the stump, they get really pretty fragile. So they get knocked over, and so forth. So we get quotes like this. The forest wanted to beg for mercy, but knew precious little about us. Pine trees roared like chainsaws, hoping this was the language of man. And to illustrate this dynamic that we are talking about, there are a lot of video clips like this online. A lot of video clips like this online. Nobody's surprised by this. That's bad. Okay? Like, every part of this is driving up your workload and your impact and your risk and everything. There's nothing good coming out of this. So, we also deal with resource extraction of an illegal. So this is intentional or purposive depreciative behavior. Depreciative behaviors are, again, those resource-oriented behaviors that we do not appreciate. They are the negative things. So throw your chainsaw in the back of your truck, cut off a burl wood, smuggle it out, make a few $1,000s from a veneer company. Okay? Veneers are very thin sliced layers out of burl, have all sorts of weird grain and tone patterns in them, and you can make very, very expensive high-end furniture out of that stuff. And you don't get it from the whole tree, you specifically get it from these tree injury sites, these tree scarified sites, spots where wasps or other parasites have laid their eggs and the wood has galled or formed scar tissue around that. This is an issue on the Shawnee, for example. Even though it's not a national park, they have a lot of recreational use, and recreation sometimes brings in attention here. If somebody is recreationally walking around in the forest and they see a huge 6-foot tall, 150-year-old gall in, some high-value species like a cherry gall or something like that would be super, super high value. Maybe that person gets the idea to come back after that recreational hike and do some poaching, make some cash. So, vegetation also is vegetation is the last layer of armor against recreation pressure after the snow is gone and before we start slicing through layers of living and then mineral soil. So especially up in the subalpine layer or habitat band here, right, this is vegetation that is just barely hanging on, and skiing although it's low friction by nature, is still pretty damaging to open vegetation, open soils. It's totally fine. It's 100% okay on several feet of fresh powder snow, right? But where they're not on snow, problem. Big problem. So to the extent that GoPro cameras and now cell phone cameras or bullet action cameras are a thing, rangers are reporting and having to interdict a lot more stuff like this. So this is, honest to God, this makes me so cynical. The National Park Service, Fish and Wildlife and stuff like that, they have to pay research companies to monitor things like Facebook and Instagram and all these other social media and video sharing sites for geotagged videos with evidence of resource damaging behaviors like this. I think these guys are actually on private property, like not a big deal, but you can imagine something like this if really anybody is doing this in a national forest with ski slopes nearby and stuff like that. Well, that's not so great, okay? This is a very high angle situation, right? Lots of kinetic energy, lots of potential energy embodied in that slope. The other problem with this is, did you see the subreddit URL here? Subreddit's name was Hold My Red Bull, okay? There's incentive here. There can be marketing associated with this. And Red Bull isn't always going through the permitting process with the Forest Service in this case to make sure that this is done in a resource respectful and sustainable way, right? They need to get in, get out, get their viral marketing campaign footage, and then, you know, their job is done. And all of us get to pay the price with the resource degradation. So the vegetation sequence of impact, what's happening across all of these different examples is basically the same. It's just a question of, does the impact stop and recovery begin, if it can, with anything less than 100% impact, extirpation. Does the recovery start, or is it allowed to start, or do we get all the way through the total destruction of vegetation and then later soils underneath? So first, we get non-native species transport in. So there might be feral goats or hogs, there might be migrating insects parasitizing your tree species. You could have other forest health threats like fungal rust or viral pathogens attacking your vegetation. It could be competing vegetation species like milfoil or aquatic duckweed. Both of these take over aquatic sources of vegetation and completely, aggressively outcompete native stuff very typically. So for stuff like this, we see boot brushes. Anybody ever seen a boot brush at a trailhead? What's the over-under on somebody's likelihood to actually use that? What percentage of visitors do you think actually brush their boots off at the start and at the end?
I mean, a lot of the ones I see, boot brushes probably.
Yeah. So that's not good. Okay.
I see a lot more people use it at the end just to clean their boots and not before.
Yeah. The problem is, when do you really need to use the boot brush? Before you go in. Right, exactly. That's the whole damn point. So this is a low compliance thing unless you make it kind of compulsory. So for example, at Mammoth Cave, when you go on a cave tour there, they walk you in, or technically they walk you out across a mat that's kind of a spongy mat, and they set it up where you cannot exit the cave tour, and all exploration of the caves is mandatorily in a tour format. You have to go out through, instead of the gift shop, this basically Lysol soaked 4x6 foot sponge. You take several steps across and it kills all the, in that case, Geomyces destructans. It's a fungus that is spreading from cave to cave. It kills all the spores on your shoes, so if you go to another cave nearby, you're not bringing it with you. Because it's already at Mammoth Cave, they're not trying to sterilize people's feet before they go in. But that would be a similar workflow to something like this. Those boot brushes, yeah, it's a great idea, but the compliance is so tough. The next kind of way to introduce impacts are by transporting in other sort of mobile invasive species like emerald ash borer, bark beetles, pine beetles, stuff like that. Yeah, once they are in, they are in. And in the case of a lot of the beetles out west, they're actually native, or some of them are native to the west slopes of the Rockies, that they are just destroying entire swaths of millions of acres at a time. It just needed to warm up the climate by a couple of degrees to not kill them all back real hard every winter with hard freezes. And so like this exponential explosion of population levels in those as they go. With aquatic invasive veg, this is people getting lazy and not washing their boats before and after they enter a water body. We've done a bunch of research here in the forestry department with Crab Orchard. What kind of signs do you put out? What kind of policies do you enforce? What kind of facilities do the boaters need to be? Really, you need 100% compliance with this, right? Otherwise, milfoil, duckweed, etc. This is duckweed here. It's going to hopscotch across the entire state in a matter of several years, and that's exactly what it's done. So once the stuff gets in, pretty hard to get rid of. And seed transport beyond live individual organism or reproducing community transporting seeds. This is not transporting seeds, this is petals getting mobilized, but the idea is similar. We've been doing this since forever. So on our boots, in our horse's feed, it is not great. So here we go.
The Kapala'oa Cabin.
This is
in the
at
crater of
Haleakala.
Haleakala National Park. Got a beautiful blue sky day today. Right now I'm standing in sort of a little patch of an African grass, which is an exotic species certainly for this area. However, it is extremely well suited to this area. As you can see, it's pretty pervasive here right around the cabin. It's drought resistant. It's very very resistant to the browsing that the nene geese and the occasional horse bring to this area. And so the park administration allows it to remain and even encourages it. Helps keep the cinder in place and helps slow down erosion just a little bit. So that's an ethical issue. The managers have to make choices on what exotic species are allowed to remain and which are not allowed to remain. In fact, Ron Nagata, the Chief of Resources Management here, has been working in some cases for 10 years on individual species of exotic invasive plants that he's been trying to eradicate. And since we're in wilderness, that means having people down sometimes on their hands and knees just pulling each individual plant out by hand. And this is a pretty big crater, so that can be a big job, especially given that the plants have to be picked in the same area on successive years until the entire seed stock is depleted. So, that gives us an interesting ethical dilemma. Which species are allowed to remain? Which species are taken out? And how much effort do you expend on those that you take out? Good morning, class.
All right. Hopefully you guys can hear that okay. But the idea here is that there are real management trade-offs. Haleakala was a sacred place, and then it was used for like low-grade cattle and sheep ranching. I mean, grazing cattle in a cinder cone at 7,000 feet elevation where this is, like, this is pretty marginal. But those ranchers brought in a lot of these grasses, and now they are here a century or more later, and like doing the stoop labor of pulling those things out one by one. It's never going to be done based on some dead idiot's bad choices.
This is poop. Horse poop. And inside horse poop are seeds. And if those seeds aren't native species, then this horse has just introduced Those are Chris's hands, not mine. Has just introduced all sorts of weed species and various kinds of hay. So the park has to grab.
So the idea here is that horses are pretty terrible at digestion. Like horses, we've selectively bred them over the last 10,000 years or so from the steppes of Asia, the high rolling plains of Asia. The grassy sea, for those of you who are Dothraki, that region was based on in the books. Horses are trying to die. Like, we have bred them so hard to be so specialized over the last 10,000 years that one thing that they really struggle with is digestion, which is a pretty fundamental function of life. Yeah. So most of these seeds that horses are eating in their hay and or straw and so forth, a lot of those seeds are still viable, perfectly viable, when they come out the horse's tail end. This was an old thing among farmers. If you want, really nice seed to plant, then you got to go buy seed from the, feed and seed store or the broker. If you're content with what passes through the horse, you can still grow a bunch of crops, but it's, do you really want to be planting the seed that's gone through the horse? Those seeds aren't going to be maximum quality anymore, even though they're still viable. So this is a huge deal. Horses need a lot of feed to get a little bit of nutritive value out of it. So you have people with horse trailers trailering their horses all over the place. This video is taken at Rocky Mountain National Park, if I recall. And horseback riding, of course, super popular up there. Who wouldn't want to ride their horse around the Rockies? But so that they can save a little bit of money on their extremely expensive horses, a lot of people have the temptation, or at least the financial incentive, to bring lots and lots of feed with them that they can get at a lower price instead of paying tourist or dude ranch prices locally at Rocky Mountain National Park. Does that make sense? So you have people bringing in all kinds of seed from all over the country into specific areas. So some national parks have flat out banned horseback riding because they can't get full compliance out of people. Some folks are just going to try to misbehave and be like, oh, well, surely my horse would never cause a problem. The rationalization is real. So that's the thing. Another way that we do seed transport is by aggressively seeded non-native invasive species like Japanese stiltgrass, Microstegium femininum. This is a huge problem on the Shawnee, to the point that it actually causes changes in how we're able to manage fire across southern Illinois. This stuff grows in such a thick thatch that in a season or two, it can go dozens of meters out from a site. It produces lots of seeds, and it tends to really colonize aggressively on the left-hand edge and the right-hand edge of a hiking trail. So when you're walking down that trail, and let's say it's 8, 9 o'clock in the morning, you got heavy forest canopy over you, lots of vapor phase water because of evapotranspiration, and you hit the dew point at 4 or 5 in the morning. So you're walking along, and there's glistening dew, like little diamonds hanging off of each blade of grass or each seed head of Microstegium. And your pants leg or your boots brush against that dew. The water on the leather or fabric of your boots makes that fabric just sticky enough to pull a few of those seed heads off. And then you walk it 500 yards down the trail, at which point you're out of the patch of Microstegium, so your boots dry off, the seeds fall off, and now they've hopped 500 meters down the trail. This is a very, very, very common invasion pattern for this particular species. Okay? And once stiltgrass gets in, man, it is a real bastard to get out. So that is going to be a thing. Also with wildlife, like your dog.
Since we're talking just briefly about the effects of off-leash animals, in this case to Since we're talking just briefly about the effects of off-leash animals in Since we're talking family, friends, and pet cheese, believe it or not.
So you can see how your dog's fur can transport seeds, but we're not thinking about that. We'll talk more, and we'll probably see this video clip again with talking about dogs and cats these days doing wildlife depredation or harassment. But there's a lot of non-native invasive seed transport that happens on pets' coats. Here's the deal. The main problem is that a dog, on average, covers 2 to 4 times as much mileage as you do walking down a trail. So if you go for a 10-mile hike, your dog, if it's in sort of that middle 50%, the interquartile range as statisticians would call it, it's gone up to 40 miles that day. You've gone 10. So that's a lot of extra crisscrossing. That's a lot of extra seeds encountered, both on and off the trail, and a lot of seeds moved along the way. Okay? And unfortunately, a lot of ticks probably picked up, but that's another conversation for another day. So we don't want to miss when you see a trailhead sign that says dogs must be on leash. This is one of the primary reasons why. Wildlife harassment is the other. Or if you've ever seen a trail that says no dogs, period, this is one of the main reasons why. Because once a non-native invasive species gets in, it's really hard. It's a lot of work to get out, but it wasn't a lot of effort to get it in. Okay? So that's kind of what we're fighting. So all of these are different ways, different means, different vectors for non-native invasive species to essentially infect one of your park's ecosystems. So what this is doing partially is species composition change. You've got a native species composition profile, and then you've got people introducing other stuff. The other stuff, if it's non-native and invasive, then it might be something like Plantago or Microstegium, where it is without any of its natural predators or pathogens. It is able to outcompete, in the case of Microstegium, which grows in thick thatches and shades everything else out. Or like Plantago species, which is also a non-native invasive species, it already grows in a prostrate life form, so you can walk across it all day long and it doesn't really care. It's even better than grasses at surviving trampling pressure. So we're going to see this composition change be a function of, we start walking through those forest forbs or those grasses, pushing them beyond the resistance phase, beyond the resilience phase, till the native stuff is dying out and the non-native stuff comes in right behind it. It's like Sir Mix-a-Lot once rapped. He loves them, then leaves them, and then he pulls up to retrieve them. You could think he's like a non-native invasive species, an opportunistic species like poison ivy, like Plantago, like Microstegium, that loves disturbance because it can outcompete, either from a growth vigor like Microstegium or a resistance to impact versus native species like Plantago or plantain. The next thing that happens is cover loss. After you trample the stuff down and replace it with non-native species, even the non-native species with additional trampling pressure start to die off, die back. So you get these bare spots that open up like scabs in the middle of a newly formed visitor-created trail or newly formed visitor-created campsite, and they grow outward from there. That's called cover loss, and it's pretty obvious to see. Okay, so exposed soil, this is extirpation. It's going to be a long time before that soil, after it's exposed, because all the plants are extirpated, they're gone, they're trampled to death, and not even the non-native invasive species can hang on. That soil is rapidly going to get truncated. We're going to cut off or erode away the biologically active upper layers of the soil, the O horizon, the A, maybe some of the B horizon and stuff like that. We're going to get down past that seed bank or destroy the seed bank, down to mineral soil, and it's going to be years before those grasses or native forest forbs can outcompete the non-native stuff hanging on at the edges and grow back through and kind of heal that scar after it's opened up. All right, so that's where the downward trend on this impact versus time graph, this is where it takes a real long time to come back down. So if the impact's happening on the order of 1 or 2 recreation seasons, it might be 5 or 10 recreation seasons for those impacts from those 2 seasons to heal over fully to the point of being indetectable anymore. Sometimes it's on the order of decades on more borderline environments like subalpine or desert. Okay? So, we tend not to get much of an interesting response from visitors on this. Some visitors actually see extirpation of vegetation as a good thing, like something to be desired. Like, I noticed our campsite in our campground doesn't have a direct laser shot trail to the bathroom. And I had nasty festival or convention food from this music festival that's at this big campground, and I needed to get to the restroom in the middle of the night, so I walked in a trail, and I've done a service to the next person at the site because when they have the Hershey squirts, I can get them to the bathroom. This is the reasoning that people put forward when they walk in a trail and create dead, bare ground like that, very typically. Or, oh, I've made this campsite nicer. I cleared back some of that awful vegetation. Now I got a place to set my tent, where they could have put it on a nice cushion of insulating vegetation and everything would have been much more sustainable. Okay? So, the reason that we care about people extirpating vegetation, exposing soil, causing total localized dieback in the space of a single campsite or multiple sort of campsites that have grown or metastasized together, like a spreading cancer. The issue is that in the climate change context, we're getting more intensified storm events. The weather goes harder, and it's going to continue to go harder and harder for at least the next century. Even if we stopped our emissions right now, we'd be dealing with more than a century of climate recovery to get back to our pre-today conditions. Okay? We are on the worst case scenario business as usual trajectory with climate. More on that in the climate section. But all that to say, a big, like 3 inches plus per storm event increase, well, that's a big deal. It's a lot more of a big deal if you have exposed soil in an ecosystem which is not exposed, which is not adapted, to having lots of exposed soils. Okay? So, problem, big problem, and getting worse. Where we have exposed soils, we're going to look at all sorts of other impacts. Okay? So, this is our graph, general impact recovery. Label this resistance. Label this resilience. This is resilience, but this is resilience while impact is happening. This is resilience after impact has stopped. Okay? So, recovering from impact takes longer, a lot longer, typically an order of magnitude or 2 longer, so 10 to 100 times longer than the trampling stimulus or impact took to walk in. Okay? So, impacts happen fast, recovery happens slowly, or sometimes not at all. So we would consider visitors riding side by side as an unnecessary impact. Where we have the exposed soil of 1 width of trail, now we've got double that. And so double the habitat loss, double the hydrologic contribution or change, double the amount of impacted soil, and so forth. Okay? So there's a lot of human cultural pressure to do this. We see taming the wilds as a thing to be desired, and the wilds typically means vegetation. So clearing a path, for example, is an aspirational value. We see it show up in pop media all the time. For an illustration of how injurious that popular idea of clearing back vegetation can be, here's a campsite recovery study. So, these photos were taken in spring of 1986, then fall of 1986, so 1 season of use. And then 5 years later, at the end of 5 years of recovery, those sites not being used any further, after 1 season of use, we should see a concrete example of what that graph is trying to show us. Impacts happening fast in 1 season, and then it taking 5 years of recovery to maybe or maybe not get across the finish line in recovering back to the pre-damaged state. So, pre-damaged state, and then after 1 season of use, that's a visible campsite, right? So we've got height reduction and species composition change and soil exposure. All of that in 1 season. All the stages of impact in about 6 months. And then close down the site after this. How does it look after that? Yikes, that's a long time.
This third foot.
Okay, so you can see that most of the impact happens kind of right away in a period of months or weeks, and then it doesn't look real good at the end of that. Here is a separate site that was closed in 1986 and then revisited later. So this is the site at the end of the season where it had been lightly used. You can see some of those low impact resistance forest forbs already shooting up, so ferns and stuff. And then in 1988, at the end of 3 seasons of elapsed time, this is what it looks like. Can you still kind of see where that campsite is? Okay, so what that means is that campsite, after 3 seasons of being closed, is not back down to 0 yet. Somewhere 50, 40, 30% left to recover. Okay? So that's hard. What this means in terms of strategy for us is where we can hammer things real hard, real fast, and then take years or decades for them to recover fully, naturally on their own. We want to sacrifice some areas. Wall off some areas and say, you know what? We're going to beat this to absolute death. There's no functional ecosystem service happening in this campsite because it's an established campsite and people are using it 100 nights a year, 3+ months, let's say, in the middle of peak season. And we know that. There's not going to be able, nothing's going to be able to grow there. So we're just going to concentrate that impact there. We're going to sacrifice zone that area and concentrate the use into that spot. Trails are the exact same thing. We sacrifice the ecosystem services of the area of the path itself, knowing that that's a fraction of a percent of the total area of your national park for the purposes of semester. And maybe we're okay with that. Maybe 99.9% still going well because the 0.1% is in trails and campsites and totally dead ecologically. Maybe that's good enough. 99.9% is pretty good, right? That's an A grade. Okay, so here's that same site in 1991, 5 years after it's had a chance to recover continuously for that long. You can still see where that campsite was because the species composition is completely different in this spot versus everything else around it. Make sense? So even after 5 years, we're not at 0% impact. So, recovery. What's happening, what's driving that slow change between those recovery pictures is soil compaction, subsidence, higher bulk density, right? All those macropores and micropores have been trampled away, and now it's a more impermeable soil surface. Root hairs have a lot harder time getting through, migrating sideways, infiltrating sideways through high bulk density soils versus nice and aerated entisols like forest soils and stuff like that. Okay, so a couple of kind of maybe moderating factors we might say. So size, just like with trees. If a seedling is small enough to avoid being trampled, like it's just a leaf poking out of the ground, like that very first leaf, then it's probably going to be fine, even if you step on it. If If it is a full-size mature tree, good to go. Seedlings and saplings in between, in trouble. Low woody shrubs, like those blueberry bushes we were talking about 2 weeks ago, highly susceptible. They are low enough to be stepped on, and each of those branches is rigid enough and skinny enough to get snapped like matchwood when you step on it. So the magic number, as it turns out with behavioral studies, is about 3 inches of branch or stem diameter. Okay, below that, pretty vulnerable. As a reminder, above that, we see people having to break out a saw to impact it. What people don't need a saw to do is to carve into fleshy succulents. So this is a bunch of plant graffiti in Hawaii, and it's pretty bad. This particular individual plant is about 8 feet tall, and it is covered root to shoot in graffiti. So this is a good sort of concrete illustration of what is a releaser cue. Somebody misbehaves, and that leaves a trigger or a signal for other people like, oh, somebody else did something. Maybe I could do that too if I'm bored, if I want to leave my mark here as well. Okay? So, and religious paraphernalia aside, that's a joke, this is pretty buck wild. So let's take a quick look, for example, at, well, here's an example of the effect of the anthropause. The effect of quarantining everybody. Oh, I'm sorry, let me get it over on the other screen here. Pause the show.